spent years writing what became known as the Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
Democrats right now, especially African Americans, have really looked back on the 1994 crime bill not very fondly. Hillary Clinton herself has come out against it, even though her husband signed it into law. Well, the author of that crime bill was Joe Biden.
The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars.
My name is Ben Burgis, and this is Give Them an Argument, episode 13. In just a moment, I'm going to be speaking to Matthew Cushbaum-Chrisman from Chapo Trap House. A little later, I'm going to be talking to Glenn Greenwald, formerly of The Intercept. And then, of course, there's David Griscom for Outlaws and Revolutionaries. But as you may know, we record this show on Saturday afternoons, live for patrons. Then it goes through some editing. The nice edited version comes out on YouTube on Monday night and out as a podcast a little bit before then. So as we're recording this, it is just a few hours after the election was finally called for Joe Biden. I think that The Onion, which has been a little hit or miss lately, nailed it with their headline, Jubilation at Trump's loss sours as news spreads that Biden won. But in any case, to talk about all of that, to break it down, I am now joined by Matt Chrisman. How are you doing today, Matt? And you are muted.
I don't do it this way, so I'm not used to it. Hello.
Hi, Matt. Obviously, I'm sure you're very excited because Joe Biden is president, and he's going to do all kinds of great things, which we know since he says he will.
We're all very, very pleased.
On his campaign website, and the way this works is that if somebody says they'll do something on their campaign website, they have to do it. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's law. That's in the Constitution.
Okay, cool, awesome. All right, so we'll get the public option and card check. And all that stuff. So I'm really looking forward to all of that. So I've been listening to some of your commentary on this from the Grill stream and from Chapo, and it seems like not optimistic. That's. I get this weird sense sometimes lately when I'm listening to this that I'm listening to something like that's sort of like this like very dark transcendental wisdom like maybe like at the what the James Woods would be giving you at the end of Videodrome, something a little bit
don't be afraid to let your body die, folks.
Fair enough. Which I believe is actually the Biden campaign slogan.
Might as well be. I mean, long live the old flesh in his case.
Right. So as part of that kind of breakdown, you've been talking about how American elections typically work in ways that maybe go beyond like even just the sort of specific dynamics of this race, which is that, well, I won't put it quite the way you do because I'm a gentleman of impeccable manners, but that there's this kind of the culture war distinction that elections are increasingly fought over has to do with the difference between like seeing the trajectory of things right now. I mean, very dramatically right now because of coronavirus and everything else, but more generally, the neoliberal hellscape that we live in, and saying, don't be too obnoxious about it, and seeing all of that, and saying, yeah, we have to accept it. Like both sides agree on that, but whatever. Like have some fun with it. Don't be a buzzkill.
Don't have fun with what?
Like so when you all right, let me back up a little bit, right? Try to see if I can clarify the thought, right? So thinking about like the sort of culture war in American elections, it seems like the distinction between people who like Trump and people who wanted Trump out has like very, very little to do with policy at this point.
Yeah, no, it has nothing to do with policy. There's no material base to American politics. I mean, obviously that's been a case for a long time. This is not new. This election did not make that case. In my opinion, the election has finally given us, at least me, an evidentiary basis to not be able to in any way imagine that there's material politics in this country in any way.
Yeah, so I mean, it's obvious enough why maybe like think that this election, the general election, wouldn't be really about material politics in any meaningful way. Nobody thinks that anything much is going to change. Probably most people who are excited about voting for Biden don't actually think that he's going to do any of the positive reforms that he says he will, because most people don't believe that politics can change anything.
Yes.
But then I guess maybe the larger question is whether there's like a larger way out of it, right? Because if you're a socialist and you have any kind of hope about the near to medium term future, it has to be based on thinking that there's something that we could potentially do to like depolarize politics from cultural lines and repolarize them on class lines, to convince people to vote to support a program that would actually benefit their material interest. That's the Bernie would have won case. But it sounds like you're no longer optimistic about that either.
There will be no convincing people. There's no pitching to people, because the people you're pitching to, they are processing your pitch through the lens of this two-party system, through the parties, not as you, as a college-educated person who has some idea of what the Democratic and Republican parties have traditionally stood for, is going to be thinking. They're going to be dealing with the parties as they exist in the current moment, which is as pure vessels for a battle about a bundle of cultural values that are learned in college, that are either accepted or rejected by those who go to college, and then are either accepted or rejected by those who become politically conscious to the point that they want to vote due to their exposure to these values in the ambient culture, which is produced exclusively by and for people who go to college, and then decide whether to adhere to them or reject them. And it has no basis in a material reality. No one who pitches material politics will have that material pitch be able to be heard above the cultural din. Any hope is going to come outside of the party structure, a way out, not done by anyone in a position to exercise political influence, because you are going to be doing that within a closed bubble, an epistemic cultural bubble, where whatever you're talking about, its material basis will be immediately, instinctively discarded by the people you're talking to, because of the bone-deep awareness made by, not through ideology, but through lived experience, as people like to talk about, of this country not having a meaningful political, not having there be such a thing as a political power that can change any of the major arcs of misery in American life.
So when you say that it have to come out of the two-party structure, I mean, maybe I'm just being too like plotted and literalistic about this, but what could that mean? Do we even know right now what that could mean?
I have no idea what it would mean. Yeah, that's why people are saying I'm blackpilled now, because I'm saying, I'm sorry, if you're watching my streams or you're looking at the internet or whatever, you are in the bubble and there's nothing you can do. Now, that doesn't mean we're doomed. That doesn't mean there's nothing you might be able to do, but you're not going to be able to figure it out by looking into this crystal ball that we've convinced ourselves is the reality, that is really just a place where we all go to amuse ourselves. If you find a thing to do, if you find a step forward to take, it is not going to come from a program. It's not going to come from a candidate. It's not going to come from any aesthetically projected campaign. It's going to be a response to conditions in your life, and it is going to be a collaboration with people in your life.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Sure.
But it is
but if it
only
happened,
viable path.
Right. So, I mean, maybe this is just, maybe what I'm asking you to do here is just a performative contradiction, because you just said that we can't figure it out. in like in this kind of way, right? But I guess I am curious about whether, like, what the gap is maybe between what you're saying now and what other people might be saying, or like maybe stuff I heard you saying like as recently as, I don't know, like a month ago or something like that, right? Which is, okay, so the Bernie thing, didn't happen. The calculation was that we could do things the other way around from what would normally make sense, that instead of having an organized working class and a movement and having an electoral politics that comes out of that, we could sort of jumpstart in a weird way in the opposite direction. And that didn't happen. And that was kind of a fluke that there was even the opportunity for that to maybe almost happen. So any sort of electoral prospects now would be much more low level. And I guess I'm curious about like whether what you're saying now is basically still that, except with like with a little bit more pessimism mixed in about like what like our ability to even discover it or coordinate it outside of like the most local things, or whether you think that we're just not going to like we just kind of have to wait for something basic to change, and we just don't even know what that would be yet.
I mean, we're going to obviously have to wait for something to change, just because this is clearly a stalemate, and this is an inert populace politically, in a way that will not be directed, that cannot be directed. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that there's no way, because that things will significantly change politically. They will have to, because conditions will continue to deteriorate in this country, and people's lives will on a day-to-day basis be worse. And that, in a country that has an illusion of a democratic process, will lead people into politics. The question is how they will do it. If they continue to be funneled into the two-party system and into elections as they exist now, you will eventually see the thing that people are talking about, which is the Republican Party being the broadly working class party. But it will be a world where working class has no connection to experience, no connection to actual relationship to means of production or even income or any of those signifiers. It will be your acceptance or rejection of a bundle of social mores, which people at the shit end of the stick when it comes to distribution in this country are going to be less and less interested in investing in, meaning with.
Okay, so this gets down the distinction. I was trying to be too cute about it earlier, whatever. I think the joke flopped, but what you were talking about as this sort of like culture war positions, you characterized as don't be an asshole and don't be a pussy, right?
Right.
That, like, so don't be an asshole, meaning that you should that you should invest in some of these cultural mores, at least, like don't be incredibly racist, things like that. And don't be a pussy, meaning like don't be don't try to regulate my behavior. If we are on a sinking ship, like we can at least enjoy ourselves on this stinking ship, in the sense that we're not having our behavior regulated this way. We're at least maybe we're not wearing masks during COVID. We get to pretend at least that none of this is happening, right? We're having some fun with it on that level. In fact, this was in some ways that was Trump's closing argument in the election. He said that if you vote for the Democrats, you're voting for not having college graduation parties and weddings, and he lists off a bunch of things. That was kind of the pitch that I'm offering. Pretend that this isn't happening and continue to enjoy your life, which wasn't entirely unsuccessful, because obviously this is not like, we now know that Biden won, but I mean, this is not the blowout that it was supposed to be. Trump came amazingly close to winning.
Yeah, and he gained in every demographic except white males. And I think what we're seeing is that the Trump is abnormal pitch worked, in that it told suburban Republicans who vote Republican mostly out of class self-consciousness, but also because due to the fact that they're aware of themselves as at the top of an economic hierarchy, they're not really interested in any kind of political party that demands that they, surrender that position, or in the absence of surrendering it, feel bad about it, which is all liberals really are asking of wealthy people, is to feel bad about being rich, not be rich anymore. And they make the absolutely logical decision to say, why would if I'm going to be rich either way, why wouldn't I enjoy being rich? But they also absorb those college mores about things like, about norms and about the value of like a free press and electoral integrity, and the idea that something like COVID should be dealt with by the federal government with a certain degree of seriousness. And they saw that and they voted for Trump, voted for Biden, but only for Biden. They voted down ticket for Republicans because they had no investment in any project other than rebuking the personal figure of Trump as this uncouth being. And couthness was the revolving question. And as those suburban Republicans said, no, thank you, a lot of working class people who haven't invested those things with meaning saw him and said, look, we're going to have Corona anyway. We're going to have economic crisis anyway. No one's getting a check. No one's getting anything. Why do I have to wear a mask? Why do I have to feel bad about not wearing a mask? And it's not just why can I have fun? It's textured. It's because everyone is alienated and miserable to some degree or another, even if they might be economically relatively well off, because nobody feels themselves that position. They only feel themselves relatively, and they feel, therefore, relative deprivation, even if they're absolutely privileged. So everyone is feeling some degree of unhappiness about the way that their life is not giving them what they wanted to. And the Trump pitch, the Republican pitch, the asshole pitch is you're pissed. If you're pissed, feel pissed, and here's people to be pissed at. And if you want to have a good time while you're pissed, here's something to do. Here, go to a party, go get some chicken wings. And why do you have to wear a damn mask?
Yeah, and again, like I think that I think I'm not even if on some level, I'm less. I've made the video drone breakthrough through less. I'm still trying to hold on to some idea that there is something that we can do to coordinate some kind of left strategy that might work, or at least might put us in a better position if something does change out of our control that changes conditions. But there is something that does have an ugly ring of truth to about this. I mean, like while I was listening to the stream where you were talking about this, I was walking the dog past, out in the middle of nowhere in Michigan, and passing a yard sign that was like "Vote Trump, make liberals cry," and I remember seeing another one earlier that was like the most like cloying sort of that yard sign with the list of all the liberal talking points, like one on top of each other, that belief science, right. Love is love,
welcome immigrants, all that stuff.
Yeah. Which as Thomas Frank points out in his new book, he talks about those signs in there. Conspicuously doesn't include anything that would have anything at all to do with, there's nothing about, somehow like raising the minimum wage or having healthcare or anything like that doesn't make it onto the list.
But even the stuff that does make it onto the list, they don't mean anything about. They don't intend to do anything about. To me, the line of the election was, and this was supposed to be the thing that was going to make it a landslide before COVID, was the kids in cages. And Trump's response was, you built the cages. And so many liberals were baffled by that. They were like, I don't get it. How can he say that? If he's saying they're bad, but he likes them, then why is it Biden's fault? What he is saying is cages come with the territory of being the United States at this point in time. And if they're going to be there, are we going to cry about them and pretend that we care? Or are we just going to accept that some things are necessary? And at the end of the day, both parties have a policy, are part of a greater agenda that necessitates savage immigration enforcement, and that will happen no matter what. So what the hell is the point of crying about it? And that is, I think if you don't believe the liberal fairy tale, the propaganda tale that, well, we're trying our best and we're going to get there someday, and yes, it was unfortunate, but it's worse under him, and we'll be better under Biden. If you don't buy that implicitly because you have not absorbed and metabolized a system of values that you mostly have encountered because it helps you in the job market more than any wellspring of emotional connection to them as like felt and lived values, mostly just etiquette that is necessary to make it in a professional milieu, then you don't fucking care. And why should you? And that is the answer that none of them have. They say they should, and people should. And look at the response. Wow, we live in a racist country. These people should care more. And that's all they have. They are more black-pilled than anyone. Liberals are more black-pilled than anyone, because the response to this election has been, wow, I guess it's a worse country than I thought it was. With nothing even remotely conceivable to change the direction of that, other than to further demonstrate their own superiority to their countrymen as everything just continues to get worse. And that is not going to be a winning electoral message.
Yeah, well, and actually it's become even more of a parody of it. I remember earlier this week, like, I don't know, maybe on Wednesday or Thursday, there was an op-ed in the New York Times responding to a lot of the statistics you just mentioned about Trump. Charles Boyle, maybe, I don't know, one of those people, responding to a lot of the statistics you just mentioned about Trump actually increasing his vote share among all of these different categories of voters, that there were more black voters who voted for Trump, still a small minority, of course, but more of them, more women who voted for Trump, more gay people who voted for Trump. And literally, like, the op-ed is 90% just rattling off those statistics. And the last couple paragraphs is, wow, racism and the patriarchy are like really powerful, and they pull in these people who are victims of them, and gosh, doesn't that make you think? So the response immediately was to default to the strategy is to call people bigots, and the strategy is even to call people who is even to call black voters and gay voters and all of these people bigots, which does go to the stalemate point, right? Because it's hard to imagine the person who thought this would work, right? That the scoldings will continue until the election results improve. I don't know that anybody really thinks that will work, but that doesn't really seem like the point, right? Like, it's not that it's some attempt to get people to switch tribes and vote for Democrats. It's just kind of an attempt to signal allegiance to the values to the values of the tribe, and to make you feel better about the choices you've made. Which, whatever. This is not new information. It's the same thing in 2016 when, Hillary was calling Trump voters deplorables during the election, after the election, making a big deal about saying that people in well-educated, prosperous areas voted for her. That if your goal was to try to peel off whoever could be peeled off from the Trump voters, that obviously wouldn't work. But there's another question about what, if anything, would work right now, and I know, I think your position is just that that we don't know, right? That they have that maybe nothing right now, because in order to get some sort of big left breakthrough, the conditions around us would just have to change in some sort of way that we can't see right, going right now. But in maybe just the last few minutes that we have together, I wonder about this, because it does seem, and maybe this is just some part of my psyche trying to cling to whatever shards of hope that there are, pathetically. But it does seem like even in the results of the election, there is some evidence that there are people who could have been peeled off by, for example, a Bernie candidacy, like the fact that the $15 minimum wage won in Florida by more than Trump did.
Well, the problem there is that people don't vote for discrete issues. They vote for candidates for political parties. And the Democratic Party will never be a party of the aspirations of working people. yes, Bernie would have done better, but Bernie didn't get the nomination. He was structurally incapable of getting the nomination, as we saw, because the people he pitched himself to in the primary were Democratic voters, which means that they have metabolized the capitalist realist notion that there is no change that is possible, which meant his entire material appeal basically went in one ear and out the other, and that the best we can do is to hold on to these cultural values, and that therefore and beat Trump. And so therefore he was a non-starter for a majority of Democratic primary voters. He had his chunk, he had his ceiling, which was higher than everybody's, or his floor support was higher than everybody's, but his ceiling was also very, very locked in by age and demographics. He needed to get in people who weren't paying attention and had not metabolized what the Democratic Party means in 2020. And he didn't get them. Now, considering how much money they spent on ads, I think that there could have been a world where they didn't spend a dime on advertising and put all that money into outreach, and maybe they're able to do something. But I think the ship has sailed now, and I think that with that now, there's no figure in the Democratic Party who can bring together issues that will in any way overcome the deep belief among the politically conscious people who you would need to appeal to get a nomination, that think change is really possible, or could cut through the intensely neurotic web of cultural signifiers that have to be kowtowed to before you can even get a hearing as a Democratic candidate anymore. So if there's going to be anything, it will not, and yes, of course there's a dream in the human breast for something better in this country, but it will not be embodied by a Democratic politician.
So if it's not embodied, by a Democratic politician, and the structural barriers to certainly third-party electoralism are, that just seems like even more deeply is something that's not going to happen. Then what are we left with? Because it seemed like when these sort of Bernie and Corbyn moments were happening in the U.S. and the UK, and whatever, we can argue about all the reasons why those were being back. I tend to think that if the Democratic establishment had been as dumb as the Republican establishment was in 2016, when they never did anything like consolidate behind Marco Rubio or somebody, that Bernie might have squeaked through in 2020. But whatever, they did learn their lesson, and that didn't happen. And now, as you say, right, it's hard to imagine there being a Bernie-like figure having that possibility again. And the third party thing seems like even more of a pipe dream. Well, when those moments were happening in the first place, it seemed like the way forward for the left was, okay, social democracy is obviously insufficient. You have to overcome capitalism, but you can at least start with social democracy and go somewhere for that. And that seemed like something that could happen electorally. And if that is, in your view, something that's basically off the table for the foreseeable future, does that mean that we need to kind of hope for something to happen non-electorally?
I think what it's going to be is, if there's any hope, it's in people organizing as workers. That's obviously kind of, you say duh, because that's supposed to be the Marxist idea, and it still is. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just that what that has meant to people has been, in this deracinated and depoliticized country, trying to build something up through the institutions that people are familiar with, through media figures, through the Democratic Party. But I think that the full cultural assimilation that has happened in terms of the way that people view politics conventionally means that anything that's going to be positive, anything that's going to be progressive, is going to be generated by people who do the math at their place of business, communicate to each other the condition of their labor, and find a sense of autonomy and control over their lives through the application of a group pressure on employment. And that because this is America, that very well might end up having a electoral expression, but it's not going to be a third party just being created out of the blue by a bunch of ex-Democrats or media figures or think tankers or podcasters or magazine writers, and it's not going to. It would be just an expression of an emergent and an emergent movement that is seeking to find a way to express itself like in a national level.
Okay, I mean, I guess like I want to, I want to believe that. I'm actually not sure if I do disagree with that. I mean, I think that the part that makes sense to me is saying that that maybe for the future of the left, electoral politics is downstream of workplace organizing.
Yeah.
And that just has to be the lesson that, like, okay, we can talk about like maybe like the Bernie thing would have gone differently if this had happened or if that had happened or the other thing had happened, but the basic reason that it was easy to defeat as it was is just that, like, it was an honest reflection of the strength of the weakness of the left as it exists right now, and the way that it's easiest to imagine a stronger left, emerging in the future would be something that was like supervened on more workplace militancy and a revitalized or maybe even different kind of labor movement. I mean, I tend to think that the at least initial electoral expression of that would still, be within the Democratic Party, at least, just because the two-party system is so incredibly resilient in the United States. It's hard to imagine how you get another electorally viable party unless by some sort of weird thing happening where like one of the existing parties collapses, like the Whigs did in the 19th century. But at that point, I guess we're just trading predictions. But meanwhile, I'm going to let you go. But just summing up. So everything is awesome. We should be very happy about everything that's happened this year. That that Joe Biden isn't perfect, but he could be moved to the left, and we'll
the
get
Cheeto is gone, and that's what matters.
Okay, that's what matters. Fair enough. All right, thanks, Matt. Always really appreciate it. Long live the new flesh.
Indeed. Bye-bye. Don't be afraid.
All right, I am now joined a little bit earlier in the show than usual by the great David Griscom, who's obviously here to do Outlaws and Revolutionaries. But before we do that, now that we do finally definitively know that it's Joe, that Biden won the election. We've already gotten some signs of how exciting that administration is going to be, like Sidney McCain being added to the transition task force.
Oh my God.
So any Any quick hot takes you feel like sharing, especially ones that might make me feel better than what we just heard from Matt Chrisman?
Yeah, man. It's good that Trump's done. I mean, I just think it's really important that we remember that this has been a really horrific period where a lot of people who definitely existed in this country, but were really catapulted into positions of power in the spotlight. It's sort of good to put an L in their column. But I mean, as we both know, it's like got a big fight ahead of us. Things are looking really weak for that movement. I think I'm going to be doing a lot more. I think I'm going to be doing something coming out with Jackman soon, specific kind of breaking down what happened in Texas, especially because the bleeding of the Latino vote for Biden, I think, is a very worrying sign going forward. And also, I hope prove some of these pundits wrong, that like demographics in themselves are destiny and that you don't have to do politics anymore because, the makeup of the population is going to change, which is just proven to be completely wrong. You got to go out there, you got to fight for votes, and you have to, from our perspective, especially do that by, building politics that excites people and will actually fundamentally change their lives, which just Joe Biden was not putting that on an offer for sure.
No, for sure not. I mean, the thing that I keep going back to, just the single data point. Glad that you're writing the Texas thing. I'm actually was actually asked to do something for Jacobin about Michigan, so maybe they're feeling the itch to get some to get some non-coastal perspectives, but the thing that I keep going back to is Florida, that the $15 minimum wage resolution won by a bunch more than Trump did.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's true. We're just kind of darkly joking around with Chrisman about this earlier, that if you look at Biden's campaign website, it says he's for that. And I guess it came up a little bit at the second debate, the one where people could finish sentences, but he wasn't campaigning on it, right? A, because he wasn't campaigning, and B, because that wasn't the pitch of the campaign. The pitch of the campaign was I'm going to be like a normal civilized person, and we'll go back to when things weren't quite so bad, which seems to have just barely worked. Is what you can give it.
And I just wanted to add to this too, because one thing that is so annoying about this conversation is, especially if you engage on Twitter, which you really at a certain point just need to learn that it's not a good place to have conversations. But somebody will like send you like Joe Biden's like plan, like somewhere deep down on his website, he was talking about a Green New Deal or like about $15 minimum wage or whatever. And it's like, it really matters how you campaign. Because it's like that's what you're going to be beholden to, and those are the ideas that people are expecting of you. Anyone can write like a huge policy book of all these things that they want to do when they're in power, but if you're not campaigning on it, then one, I don't think that you're probably going to do it, and two, there is just very, very little chance that you're going to follow through with it, because that wasn't the mandate that you were elected to. And like what we're seeing with Biden is like, okay, well, Biden's mandate essentially is like, I'm not Trump, which is not necessarily a good one from the perspective of people who are fighting for progressive policies. I think it's going to be a really weird, and especially given the state of politics, I think it's going to be a really weird next couple of years. My like hot take, strategy take, is that we should actually just completely rewrite the narrative and make the argument that we elected Joe Biden to get us a big ass stimulus check and to do that kind of immediate stuff, and basically make that idea really popular and start to like plant in people's heads so that we can have a pretty robust campaign to get that early on in the administration, because people are really suffering and they need that, and that's a short-term movement that I think would has a potential of working and would actually really help a lot of people's lives.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And yeah, you put that stuff on the campaign website, you say it at the debate, because that way you're on record about it. So that shuts up the left or pacifies the left a little bit. But of course, you don't create much of an expectation because you didn't campaign on it, and you also don't really get the benefits, right? Like it maybe pacifies your left flank, but it doesn't excite anybody outside of that, right? People, Biden, since Biden wasn't really campaigning on any of these things, I mean, my big take on, because like I've heard a lot of stuff lately about, oh, well, look, there was this really high turnout election and it was, and it went to Biden, but it wasn't a blowout. And doesn't this really disprove the idea that the left has been pushing, that there's this huge pool of untapped, left-wing voters? And what I'd always say to that is that that's not what anybody was saying, or if it was, this certainly shouldn't have been. The idea wasn't that there's this big pool of untapped voters who had like well worked out left-wing policy preferences. The idea was that most normal people don't think and talk about politics all the time. They have political impulses, they have political reactions to things. And depending on what sort of pitch they're being given, what kind of narrative they're being offered, they could be pulled in various directions. And I think, again, that Florida thing is a real sign of that, because who knows, right? Like, but somebody who voted for Trump and also voted for that, if the election had really been about that, right, they might have voted for somebody else. And certainly if the election had been about healthcare, right, Bernie Sanders, I know I always go back to this, and at a certain point I've got to stop talking about this, or I'm going to start sounding like one of those like Japanese special forces guy who's like hiding out in some cave at the end of the war and like still thinks World War II is going on in the late 1960s. But Bernie Sanders was thoroughly associated in the public mind with one issue, Medicare for all. And if he had been the candidate, then the election would have been to a great extent a referendum on that issue. And it would have been a referendum playing out against an unprecedented health crisis that was accompanied by millions and millions of people losing their private health insurance. And I guess I can't swear to know how that would have gone, but God, I would have loved to find out.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm pretty bullish on this one, actually, that I think, Bernie Sanders style campaign would have done fairly well, actually, this week. Just given exactly what you're saying, what he was foregrounding is exactly the direct antidote to a lot of the problems that we're seeing, most notably a massive health crisis. And the solution to that is providing a robust healthcare system to people who, a lot of people don't have access to it. It's just like, I mean, again, it's just like, I think it's fine, by the way. And I think you and I both agree on this. Like, hell yeah, man, have a drink with your friends, be happy, right. Celebrate the end of Trump. I mean, he's a pig, and, we should be happy about that. But I guess like I've felt ever since Wednesday that it looked pretty set what was going to happen. So I've already sort of had my moment with that, and starting to start saying, okay, well, now we have a Congress that's in shambles and a political party that was barely able to beat, in my opinion, just a very beatable candidate. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. And it's going to be hard to figure out where to go without having that kind of unifying movement that we had with the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this means that we actually have to figure it out by ourselves, right? We're not going to be swept along in the force of events, which is what really happened to a great extent with both Bernie campaigns. That there were people who I never would have expected to support that, who either because I thought they were like, milquetoast liberals, or because I thought they were like ultra leftists who would never, support anything that's happening in a Democratic primary, who did, because it was just so like anybody with a certain set of political instincts was going to be on that train, once it was going. But it seems very unlikely, certainly in the next couple of years, that anything is going to happen that's going to have quite that gravitational pull of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which means that we're in the position that we actually have to like talk and think about it and like figure out what the best way forward is for the left. I think, something we've talked about before, and I'm sure we'll talk about much more on the show and elsewhere, is that a big part of that discussion is going to have to be talking about what we can actually do to build a larger and more militant and more effective labor movement, because I don't think, like I was kind of talking about with Matt at the end there, I just don't see a way forward that doesn't go through some version of that.
I agree. And like the thing is too, I can't state this enough, and it's been something I've been harping on ever since Bernie dropped out. You need institutions like that, not only because of one, like their economic power and, you know, obviously the way that that orients people, but you need to be part of movements that are thinking together. Like there's this kind of fixation that you're just going to be able to sit in your room and, you know, get it all figured out. Like, no, which like the reason we talk about things like class consciousness is one, to get people to, you know, participate in politics in a way that they're thinking about like large groups of people. Um, but two, because when you're thinking as like a group or as a community, that sort of changes, one, your perspective, and then two, your actions. And that's been the only possible possible road forward for like left politics. That's why I'm always pointing out, you know, the only time we've had anything resembling like a viable third party in this country, you know, was after the, you know, the populist movement with the People's Party. And how did that start? It started because farmers realized they were being screwed over by merchants, and they were being screwed over by the finance system in the country. And they got together to figure out and to talk about what was going on. And then they also started realizing, like, oh man, there's a hell of a lot more wrong with the system than just like the merchants screwing us over. And that is what it was able to develop into, you know, probably like the closest thing that we've had to like a, you know, really viable third party. And obviously two, you know, ended up developing into like the Socialist Party, right? That happened because people were working together on the ground and we're coming up with like pretty radical solutions, you know, things like cooperatives, things like, you know, buying goods in bulk, you know, for the community as like, you know, in a trust kind of system. Like those kind of solutions are like what we 100% need. And I don't have the answers as to like what kind of new forms will happen, but we just can't replay the same thing over and over. We have to start figuring out places and systems and communities or whatever that we can start, you know, coming together and getting these solutions. And the labor movement is obviously, you know, the most obvious of those. I also think like tenant associations and things like that too, tenant unions, I mean, are also going to be really important going forward.
Yeah, no, makes sense to me. Yeah, I was actually sitting here thinking about how this is in content. I think a lot of this does dovetail with what Crispin was saying, but it sounds so much more hopeful when you say it. So I like that. Meanwhile, though, let's see, got some Japanese whiskey,
Nice.
Nika, that Eric Kelly, video editor, friend of the show, and filmographer, documentarian, sent me. So I am ready.
Beautiful. Well, I guess I can't, with my background, show everybody, but I got a really nice bottle of whiskey for my friend Ben for my birthday, which I enjoyed a bit of this week, but gonna have a little bit of that now too. It's good stuff. Thanks so much for this.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad you liked it. So yeah, who are we talking about today?
Well, we got to talk about Jerry Jeff Walker, who died, I believe, on my birthday, or at least the night before, October 24th. And you know, I had wanted to talk to him before, but then Billy Joe Shaver passed, and just figured instead of doing them both in the same segment, you know, you got to give them both their time. Man, where to start with Jerry Jeff Walker? He was, you know, an absolute legend, a real, you know, a lot of the guys we talk about are like the real deal. Like they live their music, for both good and bad. Jerry Jeff Walker was 100% one of these people. He's probably most well known for the song Mr. Bojangles, which we'll get into in a little bit. But like that was his, like, you know, big song. And he did a few other covers of other people's music that, you know, did well, but he's more of an institution than, you know, sort of like a chart topper. And so he was born actually in New York State, and he just you know, sort of lived his life you know, wandering around like a real kind of old school folk musician tramp. You know, there's definitely, you know, he's in the Woody Guthrie line, for example. He, you know, thumbed his way all the way down the country, you know, just, you know, hitchhiking, ended up in Florida for a little bit, New Orleans, got to New York City when he was in like the Greenwich Village scene, the folk scene here for a while. But eventually he makes his way to Austin, Texas. And it's important to note that he really was influential in like turning Austin into the outlaw country destination that it's now known for. He was one of the early people there who sort of built the scene. I believe he actually was even in Austin before Willie Nelson came back to Texas from Nashville. So, you know, he lived a full life in that sense, you know, but classic country stuff, short temper, got lots of fights, trouble all the time, a lot of drinking, things of that nature, which I think is a good segue as any to talk about the song Mr. Bojangles, man. It honestly, it's probably one of my favorite songs ever. I've loved that song since the first time I heard it as a kid. I listened to it in many different stages of my life. It honestly, not to be too sentimental, it honestly always, if it hits you in the right mood, it'll bring a tear to your eye. And it is worth noting, definitely listen to the song, but it's a really sweet story that is loosely based on a true story where he was caught up in a drunk tank in New Orleans. And, you know, you have to spend the night there, and he gets talking to this guy who basically, you know, was just like a street performer and a dancer. And he'd just try to, you know, get a living off of that. And he was, you know, saying how he was always in jail because of, you know, his drinking and, you know, obviously his activities. And you have to remember, I mean, the police are bad now, but just back then they would like throw you in jail. You know what I mean? You just look the wrong way, they just put you in jail. But anyways, they're sitting there and they're talking, and he's just was, you know, a bright, like a happy guy despite all of this. And he starts talking about, you know, how he's basically been homeless for a really long time, and he had a dog that he misses desperately, and the dog, you know, passed away. But anyways, you know, so this is a sad story. But the reason the song, I think, is just so beautiful is that, you know, this guy is basically telling Jerry Jeff Walker in the song, you know, this really sad story about his life, and then just gets up in the middle of it and starts dancing like the most beautiful, you know, happy dance you could ever imagine. And it's just a great song, I think, because it's like finding a bit of beauty in a really ugly and cruel world. And it's really sweet for that. I highly suggest people, you know, check it out. And, you know, that's how he became famous. Sammy Davis Jr., you know, would do that song. You know, he did, like, I believe on the Tonight Show, right? So this had like mainstream appeal, but it's also, you know, a kind of song that, you know, people who are really living that kind of hard up life, it really speaks to them too. And like, that's an incredible part of Jerry Jeff Walker. But yeah, let me think, because I got some good stories. But like, it's important to note too that, like, so he was this kind of like country music godfather almost in a lot of ways. He helped a lot of guys out. Guy Clark, for example, Jerry Jeff Walker sang his song, you know, LA Freeway, which is Guy Clark's like breakout song. And, you know, Jerry Jeff Walker said something to the effect of Guy Clark is like, you know, this is going to be a really great song, and, you know, you're on the verge of, you know, breaking out. You know, so he was always like uplifting other people and really bringing them into the limelight and fame, because he was such a trusted voice, and was so respected in the country music world. Funnily enough, I am a stan of Jimmy Buffett. He might be somebody. I mean, I don't listen to Jimmy Buffett regularly, but man, Margaritaville is a fun song. You know, it's just whatever. It's fun music. But Jimmy Buffett also claims that Jerry Jeff Walker basically made his career by introducing him to Key West. Okay. Which is a pretty funny acknowledgement there. Also, you know,
I mean, I lived in South Florida for 6.5 years, so I maybe have mixed feelings, but I got you.
Hey, man, you know, the parrot head, I've always been joking, when I turn 30, I'm going to be a full-time parrot head. So I got 2 years before I'm living that lifestyle. You know, Ray Wiley Hubbard, too, is another guy who Jerry Jeff Walker, you know, got moving. You know, they called the kind of country music that Jerry Jeff Walker, you know, sort of was the trailblazer for, like, progressive country, or like cosmic cowboy country. Yeah. Which I love so much, you know, and that's like the outlaw scene in Austin and in Texas in general, what they were doing out there. So I mean, it's just incredible stuff. You know, definitely check out songs like Drifting Way of Life, The Wheel, Hill Country Rain. That's Why I Play.
Yeah, we should put together a Spotify playlist of the of songs that have been mentioned in these segments, and at least make it available to patrons.
That's a great idea for sure. Yeah. Mississippi are on my mind too. Also, one I think you'll like a lot, Ben, which I don't think he wrote, but he has a great version of it called "I Feel Like Hank Williams Tonight,"
Yes.
where he basically talks about, I play classical music when it's raining, but tonight I feel like Hank Williams. It's just it's just a fun song all the way through. But let me just a couple quick stories because they're fun as hell. Well, one that should be noted too. Sorry, not to go too far. Is like I like one thing about Jerry Jeff Walker too. Is like he's such a Texan in a lot of ways, even though he wasn't from there. And I think he really, not to go on too much of a Texas rant, but I love I like people like that, and I like that about Texas, that you can sort of come there and make it your home. But I'll just tell this real quick, sort of in closing. So he was constantly getting in fights, and there's a lot of stories about him getting roughed up by like groups of people, and but there's this story about him and Willie Nelson, who was his good friend, and Willie Nelson's a pretty nice guy, I think, in appearance, and I think in truth too. But apparently one night Jerry Jeff Walker was hanging out with him and a few other people, and he'd been drinking a bunch, and he kept on picking up Trigger, Willie Nelson's guitar. And everybody who knows anything about Willie Nelson, he loves that goddamn guitar. He's been fixing it up for years, and he kept on playing with it. And Willie's like, "Hey, put that down." And Jerry Jeff Walker just refuses. He's like, "No, I'm serious. Like, really put it down." And the story goes that Jerry Jeff Walker basically just continued to ignore him. So Willie Nelson stands up and punches him right in the mouth. And it's just like, you have to be a certain kind of character to get Willie Nelson, who's, always chill, that kind of mad. But yeah, anyways, Jerry Jeff Walker made some really beautiful music. He's a touching man, and everything I've heard about him, despite his, very briefly, but another really good one is Jimmy Carter. Invited him to the White House, and because Jimmy Carter was a big fan. So Jerry Jeff Walker shows up, and he's waiting for Jimmy. Jimmy is the president, so like something came up, and after like 15-20 minutes or whatever, Jerry Jeff Walker just storms out, and he's so pissed that his time was wasted, and he says, "Well, Jimmy Carter don't go to bars, and I don't go to the White House anymore." But despite that propensity for sort of blow-ups, he seems to be a really kind person. And from my friends and family, people I've been talking to in Austin, I never had the luxury of getting to meet him or see him play. But everyone who I've talked to has told me that, he's a really just kind and a good man through and through. He'll be sorely missed, but he made such a big impact in both the culture and country music in general.
Thanks so much, David.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
All right, talk soon. right. I am now joined by the great Glenn Greenwald. I've been reading your stuff for a very, very long time. There's a point I think in during the Obama era, when I wasn't very politically active, but I think my main political activity was reading Glenn Greenwald articles in Salon and using them as cheat sheets for arguing with my liberal friends at the bar about drones and civil liberties. So very good to see you.
Yeah, it's very nice of you to say. It makes me feel a little bit old, but I'll take it.
Fair enough. Since then, you post Salon, you were at the Guardian, and after the Guardian, you had you helped to found the Intercept, a publication that you just left. So can you tell us a little bit about why you started the Intercept in the first place, and then what happened such that you ended up leaving?
Sure. So I think a lot of it has to do with how I started my career in writing versus the way more traditional journalists did. And I think this was what explained a lot of the confusion on the part of other journalists as well about what happened. I didn't go to Columbia Journalism School. I didn't get a job at the New York Times in some entry-level position. I never wanted to do any of that. I just kind of started a blog in 2005, largely because there were things I wanted to say that I felt like weren't being said. At the time, I was a lawyer, and I was really interested in executive power theories and abuse of civil liberties on the part of the Bush administration in the war on terror. And so when I started my blog, the way it would work is, it was a free platform, and I would just kind of open a post and write what I wanted to say, and didn't care who I was pleasing or angering. I just wrote exactly what I felt. And that's why it became so gratifying to me, and also why it began to grow. And so this model of being able to write freely without editorial intervention, without people censoring you, was fundamental to how I began writing. And so when I went to Salon, when I went to The Guardian, when they offered me jobs, the condition for my going was that I would continue to have the same right, not just to publish without an editor, but to post publicly to the internet without even an editor being needed to do that. And they revamped their system to let me to do it. So in 2013, in the middle of the Sunday reporting, when I started The Intercept, I did it in part to guarantee to other journalists that same kind of editorial freedom and journalistic independence that I had enjoyed all those years, because I believed, and still do, that preserving the right of journalists to speak freely in their own voice, not to be homogenized or flattened by editors, is something that's necessary to make journalism vibrant again and interesting and honest. And so, that was part of what The Intercept concept and vision was, and also to always be adversarial to intelligence agencies and government agencies and those who wield power. And so obviously, I feel like it's gotten off track some in those broader senses in terms of those bigger values. But as I made clear when I left, I wanted to publish an article. They tried to not just edit it, but prevent me from publishing it without major alterations that I didn't agree with. And so having my freedom of expression constrained or curtailed that way was just entirely unacceptable. I obviously didn't create my own media outlet to impose upon myself restrictions that I never had previously had.
Oh, hold on, you're muted, Glenn.
Yeah, I just did that because I have a dog who's barking, so I'm gonna.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Actually, it's making me a little bit nostalgic, because one of the last times, I don't know, one of the times last year, I was a guest on the Michael Brooks show in studio. I would do a weekly call-in segment, but like only every once in a while, I'd go in studio. And one of the last few times I did that, he interviewed you at the beginning, and I remember sitting there on the couch and hearing all the dogs in the background. But yeah, so this is an important point, right, for anybody who's kind of following this, because very quickly after you announced that you're leaving The Intercept, this sort of party line response that formed like right away was, look at Glenn Greenwald whining about censorship, when really, he's just talking about editing. All journalists get edited. What are you talking about, right? And I think that it's important to make maybe a couple distinctions here. I mean, one, I do think on the larger issue, when you think about issues about free speech, and not just free speech in the narrow sense, but like why we value free speech, the free flow of information, the free exchange of ideas. Sometimes I'm a little disturbed when I see leftists and progressives starting to sound like right-wing libertarians on this topic. Like, it doesn't. So, what some newspaper does, what Twitter does, none of these have anything to do with free speech. Free speech is only about what governments do. And then the other issue is that context matters, right? Because I think that some of this was cynical, but some people probably saw some of those emails exchanged. They thought, okay, well, I've been asked to alter articles, as much as this. What's the big deal? And I think that what I'm hearing you saying, and it's maybe worth like circling and underlining a couple of times, is that if it might not have been a big deal if this was something that was just the well-established relationship that you had with the editorial team at The Intercept, that they made judgment calls about the content of articles, that they decided whether they thought that something was a worthwhile story or not. They decided whether or not they thought your interpretation of the story was fair. And in this case, maybe you disagree with some of the calls, but no big deal. But it wasn't, right? You said you specifically started this publication to not have that relationship, and for many years, right, for several years, this was basically respected. I mean, you were not, you weren't subject to this kind of editorial oversight.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, first of all, I think there's a lot of jealousy and resentment, petty, bitter resentments in journalism, like there is in a lot of professions, but I think it's particularly acute in journalism. I've noticed it many times before. So, of course, there are a lot of journalists who have shitty jobs and work under terrible conditions, and that's really true, and I have empathy for them. And so when they see my ability to have the leverage to negotiate this special arrangement, which I have negotiated and I realize is rare for the field, they kind of feel angry about it. Like, why should he get to publish without being edited when he wants to? And I'm constantly having to negotiate with my editor over what I can and can't say. And that may be true. Like, there may be a lot of journalists who only work well with editors or who need to be edited all the time. But as you pointed out, this has never happened to me in 15 years of writing before, not at Salon, not at The Guardian, and never at The Intercept until now. And I feel like it's worked out pretty well for me. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never had a story retracted. I've never even had a major correction. I've broken a lot of big stories. I've had a lot of impact with my journalism. I have a big audience that has always grown inexorably. So apparently people like the writing, even when it's not being edited, or maybe because of that. And, I think that, for me, if it were the case that I was always being edited, and then suddenly I started complaining that being edited is censorship, I would understand this grievance, but that has never been how I've worked. As you point out, the only exceptions are if I'm doing some very original, complex reporting, like in the Snowden reporting, in the Brazil exposés we did last year, I did work with editors. It was my call under my contract. That's the arrangement, is if I think there's either legal liability possible for the outlet, I have to ask for a legal review. If I think that it's beneficial for my journalism, I ask for to work with editors, which I've done in the past. But an article like this would never have generated editorial scrutiny had it not been for the fact that it was going to be extremely controversial because it was coming shortly before an election that all the editors at The Intercept were highly invested in terms of the outcome. And it wasn't like anybody thought, this is, I think, the other confusing part is, it wasn't like anyone really thought that my article was going to sway the outcome of the election, right? Like, in order to do that, you have to really produce something extraordinary. And my article really was just kind of a recap. It was like my own analysis of the reporting that had been done as opposed to original reporting. So nobody thought, including me, obviously, that it was going to make the difference in the election. What they were really petrified of was that in 2016, we were one of the outlets, along with the New York Times and a few others, that did a lot of reporting, meaning we did our jobs, about the highly relevant emails that were published by WikiLeaks that showed high-level corruption of the DNC, cheating by the DNC in the primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and that showed other aspects of Hillary Clinton's behavior, like her speeches to Goldman Sachs, that she was trying to conceal. And because of that reporting, starting basically from election night in 2016, when Trump won, for the next 4 years, all we heard, both internally but externally, is, oh, you behaved poorly. You're responsible for Trump's victory because you did this reporting on Hillary's emails. And they were petrified that had I published this article, they would spend another 4 years hearing from their friends and their colleagues and people at the New York Times and on Twitter, oh, look, you did it again. Either if Trump won, you helped Trump win again, or you tried to help Trump win by publishing this article about Biden. And if you're a journalist who's petrified of what people are saying about you because you've done reporting, you should go pick another field of work. So that's one thing, it kind of like, disgusted me. And had they simply honored the standard way that we worked, which was by letting me publish these kinds of articles without editorial scrutiny, no one would have really bothered with it. It wouldn't have really been a problem. But the reality is, the Intercept has become this outlet over the years, the last few years, that is kind of the kind of outlet that I created the Intercept to counteract and to undermine and subvert. It frequently quotes intelligence officials anonymously with no evidence, including a week before my article that I wanted to publish. The Intercept published a bullshit article claiming that former CIA officials like John Brennan and James Clapper and Michael Hayden claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop materials were Russian disinformation, which turned out to be totally false, but the Intercept published it. So had the Intercept been this publication that had very rigorous, lofty editorial standards they were simply applying to me because that's what they believed in, I could have even swallowed it more. But the reality is, if you want to publish something at the Intercept that aggrandizes liberal preconceptions or flatters left liberal ideological goals, you can publish anything you want. There's no editorial standards applied. It was very specific, very unique, and very deliberate because of what I was writing when I was writing it. And that's why it was censorship. Not because I think being edited is inherently censorious, but because the motives with which it was being done and the way in which it was being done was all about the perspective I was voicing and not about anything concerning editorial standards.
Yeah, so that's worth like just kind of nailing in before we move on to broader topics, because if what we're talking about a lot of times when we talk about censorship is not, of course, government censorship is one thing, but very often that's not what we're talking about. If you have, look, even if you have like a private university that doesn't allow, students to bring in certain speakers, there's no issue of government censorship or the First Amendment there, but I think people would naturally refer to that as censorship. So what we mean by censorship in a lot of context is obstacles to the free flow of information or ideas that we consider to be illegitimate. And what's illegitimate depends to a certain extent on context. I think that, look, I write for Jacobin. It's a publication that exists to promote a certain political point of view. If there's editorial, direction that has to do with that, with the political point of view being promoted, that that doesn't strike me as illegitimate because it's part of the nature of it. And similarly, you have publications like, the National Review on the right or whatever that exist to support that. There are other kinds of publications that are supposed to be more neutral referees, and there's the Intercept, which, as you say, you founded specifically to let journalists pursue the stories they want to pursue and to give their commentary in a relatively unfiltered way. And I think you heard you say that this is even like spelled out in your contract, your employment contract there, that they wouldn't do this. And they did this for the first time in 15 years, specifically because of the story about Hunter Biden, which, even if nobody there is foolish enough to believe that there are swing voters in Wisconsin who are hanging on every word that's published in the Intercept to see what they think about this story, to decide whether to vote for Biden or Trump, there's this obvious pressure not to be seen as trying to help Trump win. And it's something that's also obviously a story that in general, the media class was very concerned about. That the Twitter famously went as far as to stop people at one point from even DMing each other the link to the story, which is really extreme and disturbing for reaction. And so in context, it seems like there are some pretty clear political motives. Certainly the motives can't be editorial. That doesn't make sense on its face, considering both the prior arrangements being upended and also the fact that if people read the email, right, which they can on your Substack, then the objections that were being made weren't objections on matters of fact. They were objections about interpretation of the facts, and that seems like precisely the sort of thing that under this contract, under the arrangement that had been honored before, and under the mission statement of the organization, that seems like the sort of thing that they particularly were not supposed to interfere with. So, and I guess before we completely move on from this, just one issue that I think is worth highlighting is that what you think about the election should be a slightly separate issue from what you think about like the role of journalists or what sorts of stories should be pursued by journalists, or at least I certainly think so, right? That like I'm somebody who did argue for leftists in swing states at least holding their noses and voting for Biden for various reasons having to do with the National Labor Relations Board and other things. But I'd like to think that we can make that, I mean, I don't know if you agree with that or not, right? But I'd like to think that whatever somebody makes of that issue, that they can make their case, they can make their case honestly, right? That they don't have to actually try to hide information about the pros and cons of giving candidates in order to make a case about how people should vote. Worst case, like you could act like French socialists and communists who voted for Macron to stop Marie Le Pen from coming in, but would even talk about doing things like wearing rubber gloves to the polls. But two, even if you do think that this is bad, you should make some kind of pragmatic trade-off here, you should try to minimize this information that makes the Biden family look corrupt, because the election, even if you think that political strategists should make that calculation, surely that isn't, or at least shouldn't be, the role of journalists.
Yeah, there's several interesting points in what you just raised. And so let me start with the question of censorship and free speech, which is a extremely important topic to me, always has been, not just as in my work as a journalist, but even before that as a lawyer. Obviously, the Constitution, when it guarantees free speech, is only guaranteeing the right to be free of state or official censorship. But we clearly have a broader meaning when we talk about free speech. It's been not just a legal concept, but one of values. It stems from the Enlightenment, when the idea was that no institution, whether the Catholic Church or the monarch, ought to have this place where it resides beyond ever being challenged or questioned. So free speech wasn't originally conceived of as a constitutional dogma or legal doctrine, but as a societal value. And one of the things that I did find so odd, because that day when Twitter was barring you from even posting a link to an article by the New York Post, the oldest newspaper in the country, the fourth largest one. Yes, it's a tabloid owned by Murdoch with right-wing politics, but it's actually a real newspaper with reporters and stories broken. It's not some fake news site that was created 3 months ago on Facebook. It was stunning. And when then Facebook dispatched the former Democratic Party operative to announce that it too would algorithmically suppress the story, it was a kind of big-footed censorship by the Silicon Valley overlords who reside outside of democratic accountability, let alone constitutional constraints. And I found it so bizarre, as you've alluded to, that leftists started sounding like Cato Institute scholars or Koch brother libertarians when they were saying, this is a private institution, they have the right to do whatever they want. This isn't about, okay, first of all, let's imagine that tomorrow, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, all private corporations not regulated by the Constitution, hold a joint press conference and say the following: anybody who criticizes Donald Trump and the Republican Party shall be banned instantly, and Google will not list any articles or websites containing criticism of the Republican Party. Only criticisms of Democrats and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris shall be allowed. Would anybody have any doubt understanding why free speech values have been implicated, even if the Constitution itself hasn't been violated because those are private actors? I sincerely doubt it. Because as you point out, free speech means the free flow of information, not just the state's interference with it. There's another ideological aspect to that, though, which is the question of monopoly power, which has always been extremely important in left politics, going back more than a century. 2 months ago, just 2 months, the Democratic-controlled House Committee on Antitrust, I forget the full name, antitrust, trust, monopolies, whatever, issued a huge report that concluded that 4 tech companies, including Google, Amazon, and Facebook, particularly Facebook, are monopolies. They have monopoly power and therefore ought to be regulated by the state, either broken up or treated as a trust, the way water and electricity companies are treated as utilities, as part of the public trust. So that was the other bizarre thing of leftists saying, oh, leave Facebook and Twitter alone, they can do whatever they want, aside from the fact that they wouldn't accept that or think that way if it were the reverse. Imagine if the New York Times link to, links to the New York Times reporting on Trump's tax returns had been blocked, people would flip out. But it's also the case that these companies are not just any other private companies. They have massive power in the marketplace of ideas. And therefore, what they do is our concern in terms of free speech. And I just want to touch on the question of journalism and its role, because I think it's a really interesting one that you raised. I mean, I get that there are people who are very vested in the outcome of the election who believe that Trump is this unique fascist threat and that we have to do everything and anything possible to defeat him, and therefore I shouldn't be, or nobody should be, reporting negatively on Biden in the days up to the election. And I get that opinion. The person who has influenced me most intellectually in the world, and someone who I regard as one of my closest friends, Noam Chomsky, has spent 9 months saying that. And I've had disagreements with him publicly and privately, but I completely respect that view. And I think one of the things that the left needs to learn how to do better is have these kind of disagreements without treating them like they're heresy or blasphemy or things that people deserve to be expelled from good left-wing discourse the minute they diverge from whatever consensus there is. But the issue of the role of journalism that you raise is a really important one, and it's one I've thought a lot about. So let me leave you with this on this question. So in 2018, Jair Bolsonaro, who I regard as a actual fascist with, unlike Trump, with the capacity to implement that vision, somebody attacked my family many times, including before he was inaugurated, and then of course tried to imprison me at the beginning of this year. In 2018, on the campaign trail, he was stabbed by this kind of a lone actor who was psychologically disturbed, and he came very close to dying. Had he got to the emergency room 3 minutes later, he would have bled out from the wound. So imagine you're the ER doctor who's on duty when Bolsonaro was brought in, and you believe very strongly that Bolsonaro is a fascist who will try and end Brazilian democracy, will harm a lot of people, maybe kill them, if he survives and then win. So you have 2 choices. You could either intervene medically to try and save Bolsonaro's life by acting as an ER doctor, or you can decide that his life is not worthwhile to save, that the world would be better off if he were to die, and you could purposely let him pass away. I don't think anyone wants doctors arrogating unto themselves that calculus, because that's not the role of a doctor. In order to have a healthy society, you need to have doctors have the view, my role is simple, it's to save all lives, period, not to decide who lives and who should die. That's a decision way beyond my ken. And if doctors started doing that, even if they did it in a way that you liked, like letting Bolsonaro die, that would be really menacing for the society. That's how I see journalism. If I want to work for Joe Biden, I should go work for the DNC or the Biden campaign or an activist group or whatever. But if I want to do journalism, I'm undertaking the obligation, like the doctor undertakes the obligation to save all lives, to publish all information that I think the public has the right to know about powerful political actors, including Joe Biden, including Democrats, even if it's before the election, and then let other people say, his campaign, his lawyers, his, surrogates, whatever, oh, this evidence is not relevant compared to the Trump corruption scandals, it's insignificant, whatever they want to say. But to ask journalists to corrupt their own role, to pervert journalism and convert it into shilling or being spokespeople for a political party or a presidential campaign, if you're on the one hand claiming that you're worried about democracy and democratic values that Trump is threatening, but on the other advocating that model of journalism, there's a huge antagonism there, because journalists who start manipulating public opinion instead of informing the public are themselves threatening democracy in really fundamental ways, and it's just something I don't believe in.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I should say, by the way, to clarify, I don't actually quite agree with the Chomsky position. I don't think Trump's a fascist. I just, I think that the differences between, a right-wing Republican who do things like appoint union busters to the National Labor Relations Board and a mediocre, shitty centrist Democrat who at least wouldn't do that, right? Are things that do make a difference to me. But I think that since you mentioned Chomsky, right? And you said he was greatest influence on you. You mentioned Bolsonaro and the threats that he's made in the past and continuing against you and your family. I believe your husband David is a congressman in Brazil and is a member of a small socialist party. And all of this makes it kind of funny to me because an idea that I've seen a lot, especially in the last week since you left the Intercept, is Glenn Greenwald is moving to the right, and he's like becoming some sort of right winger, crypto right winger. I've seen people like compare you to Christopher Hitchens, as somebody who started out, on the left. And became a right winger, or actually, the most extreme example I saw. Don't want to speak ill of the person who said this particularly, but I think it says something about a lot of what's floating around about this subject. Was somebody who I think reacting to some of your concerns about free speech and also your willingness to go on Fox News. Sort of said, so he's kind of like becoming like one of these like IDW people, like intellectual dark web, which I thought was very funny because, certainly I remember reading when you used to very fiercely attack Sam Harris, who actually is in that group, and the time I see your name most often is when I'm looking back at my bookshelf, and you are the top quote on the front cover of my late friend Michael Brooks' book Against the Web, which is framed as a critique of those same people. So what do you make of this narrative that you somehow moved to the right or becoming a right winger or on some sort of Christopher Hitchens like trajectory? I mean, I don't necessarily like, if you don't want to dignify the actual substance of that, that's fine. But why do people think things like this? Why, how have we gotten to a place where this is the sort of hair trigger accusation that people make in these situations?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. I think the short answer for me is that we are stripping politics out of our politics. So in the case of Christopher Hitchens, for example, I do think he made a shift to the right. He made a hard turn to the right. Now, why do I think that? It wasn't because he went on Fox News, which says nothing about his ideology, right? There's nothing ideological about doing that. There might be a judgment about who you think you should speak to and not, or a strategic choice about how you get heard or don't. There's nothing ideological about that, right? Like, ideology has a meaning. It means your view about the relationship between the government and the citizenry, the politics that the state ought to adopt, the kinds of economic and foreign policies that you believe are just or unjust. And in the case of Christopher Hitchens, the reason a lot of people said, including me, that he made a hard turn to the right is because he started advocating things that were clearly a byproduct of right-wing ideological outlook, like invading Iraq in order to change its government, or defending the war on terror and imperialism in general, and heralding it as some kind of a noble and benevolent gesture toward the world to improve people and for their own good, bomb their countries and change their governments, which has long traditionally been a right-wing ideology, an ideology with which I have vehemently disagreed. So when people started saying that Christopher Hitchens had moved to the right or made a conversion to the right, it wasn't because of the people that he was like talking to or hanging out with, or anything like that. It was much more substance than that. It was the views that he started advocating what views have I started advocating that are different than the views I've always advocated since I became a journalist? What right-wing views do I hold? None. I think that what has happened is that in a lot of ways, left politics has changed in the United States. So, for example, I think that free speech, which always was a left-wing value, I mean, it came out of like Jewish leftism and like the kind of like left-wing Jewish politics that came from the end of World War I, the dissent over the involvement of the U.S. in World War I, the attempt to criminalize that with the Espionage Act, and then extending into the 50s and McCarthy repression. And free speech maximalism was always a value of left-wing politics. It was almost all Jews that were composed the ACLU, the donors, the lawyers, the people who were the activists. And I mean, if you go back and look at who was marching in the 60s in favor of free speech in Berkeley and elsewhere, it was all leftists, and censorship was found on the right. I mean, that was what the moral majority wanted. It was what, people tried to do with films and with records, and the left was indignant over that stuff. So when I advocate free speech, something I've always advocated, it may be that it now seems like a little bit of a right-wing ideology, but that's not because I changed. It's because the left has kind of morphed into a movement that has increasingly adopted authoritarian strains, which I disagree with. And I know you wrote a book on that and have talked about that as well. And Michael did a lot as well. I was concerned about that very same thing, those incursions into core left-wing values when it comes to individual liberties. So I think, the reason, one of the problem is that when I say politics is being stripped out of our politics, what I mean by that is now it's kind of like being on the left or being on the right has nothing to do with ideology anymore. It's kind of like a tribal signifier. So what shows do you go on? Do you go on with Chris Hayes and like Democracy Now? And I do go on Democracy Now quite a bit. Or do you go on, Fox News and Tucker Carlson and Sagar and Jetty and Rising and it's like a very kind of superficial middle school assessment of the people with whom you're communicating and the strategic choices you're making, rather than what it should be about, which is about politics and ideology. So I think that's part of it. And then I also think that there ends up being this kind of these litmus tests of things that you're supposed to affirm in order to prove which tribe you're a member of. And obviously social media exacerbates this greatly because it has so much to do with constant signaling of which side you're on, which group you're a part of, whether you're part of an in-group or you're in the out-group. And so things like Trump is a fascist, Trump is a unique evil, all of those sorts of things are supposed to be left-wing values, even though I don't see any ideology in that either. That's just a question of how you view history. I think Bush and Cheney are at least as bad as anything Trump did, and probably worse, which you can argue with as a judgment, but it's not a right-wing judgment to say that George Bush and Dick Cheney committed more evil in the world than Donald Trump did. And then, same thing, a lot of it had to do with Russiagate, where like affirming that Donald Trump colluded with the Kremlin was supposed to be something you were required to affirm in order to stay in good standing on the left. And to me, that was also never an ideological question. It was an evidentiary one. Do you see evidence to support the claims of the CIA and the intelligence community that happened? Journalistically, I just didn't. And I also found that kind of odd because claims about Kremlin infiltration and Americans collaborating with the Russians, that's just something as a leftist, someone vested in left-wing political tradition, I repel from, not feel comfortable with. Both but either way, I think that's the problem, is that so many of these labels. Like, I remember the first time I heard it was the Hillary Clinton campaign in mid-2016 released a creepy video with like pictures of the Red Square and the Basilica and this kind of like McCarthyite voice saying, what does Donald Trump have in common with the Russian government? What are they doing in bed together? And it just instinctively seemed McCarthyite to me. From something out of the Cold War, like a bad Cold War film.
Right.
So I think that like, if we're going to talk about left and right, we need to make certain that there's at least a touchstone to something serious and political and ideological and not like tribal or group based.
Yeah, right. And also, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think there are obviously the extremely ugly historical associations, but also, I mean, I guess I just think, maybe I'm just too paranoid, but I mean, like since this stuff started, I've thought that that it just seems inevitable that the people who, if you normalize these kinds of accusations, that people being Russian agents, or or unwitting agents of Russian influence, or like this is like really something you can use to take somebody down politically. It always just seemed obvious to me that the people who are long term going to be the biggest victims of
Well, and they used it against Sanders, which was so predictable. When he first ran in 2016, the right was saying things like, "Why did you honeymoon in Moscow? And what is your relationship with the Soviet Union? Why did you go to Cuba when you were the mayor of Burlington? Why did you go praise the Sandinistas after you got back?" So they were red baiting him in 2016, but then the Democrats started doing it as well, both from that like Cold War perspective of why do you love Castro? Why do you love the Sandinistas? But then also the kind of Cold War 2.0. Remember, after he won Nevada, somebody leaked to the Washington Post the claim that the Bernie Sanders campaign had been briefed by the CIA, that the Russians were trying to help his campaign. So suddenly at the peak of his ascent, they suddenly took this Russiagate script, which is so predictable and so many of us were warning about, which to Sanders' blame, he had been affirming himself, and it got deployed against him in the most predictable way possible, saying now the Russians want Bernie Sanders to win.
Yeah, and again, I think that if like the people who seem to be, who I would imagine long term are going to be most likely to be accused of being Russian agents would presumably be people who are the most critical of American foreign policy. If there was, like if one of these kind of proxy war conflicts between the United States and Russia, Ukraine, whatever, like if that ever got to some crazy point where there were like American ground troops, involved in that, then certainly there would be actually at this point it would be impossible to imagine people who are opposed to it not being accused of being Russian agents or Russian dupes, which might happen anyway, just in the course of things. Like that's how defenders of imperialism tend to work. But now it's been given all of this credibility because there have been years and years of people in both sort of centrists, like in the MSNBC sphere, but also people in various forms of progressive media to the left of that, who have given it credit and credence, and even really treated not being on board with that narrative as like prima facie evidence of having like unsavory motives of some kind.
Right. And, I think one of the things I think is interesting is, and then I do worry about as well, is we were talking before about this kind of tendency to judge left and right, not based on ideology or politics, but on associations. I've always found it very strange that over the last 4 years, if you are on the side of the Trump administration when it comes to Russiagate or other controversies that aren't really ideological but evidentiary, or if you go on Tucker Carlson or Fox News or whatever, that's indicia that you are now on the right. But if you agree with David Frum and Bill Kristol and the CIA and, Michael Hayden, George Bush's former CIA and NSA chief, that's somehow totally fine. That's just like a coincidence of, finding yourself on the same side. And I think there's been insufficient effort devoted to the question of why all those neocon scumbags and like Bush Cheney goons are so vehemently and desperately devoted to destroying the Trump presidency. You can say part of it is personal. They got displaced in their, kind of consultancy gigs by this outsider who didn't want to hire Steve Schmidt or Rick Wilson or whatever. You can say that, well, he just kind of stumbled into a questioning of Cold War NATO pieties or Israel or whatever. But there has to be some reason, right, why those people who have done more harm than anyone over the last 30 years in American politics suddenly have found their most devoted enemy in Donald Trump and the Trump presidency. And before people jump into bed with them, I think there ought to be some interrogation about why he has alienated those kinds of factions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Trump has done some of the things that they would want. Presumably, he sold heavy weaponry to Ukraine, which Obama didn't do. It's as hard as this is to remember. It used to be a Republican talking point that Obama was too soft on Russia. He doubled effectively I mean, it depends on how you measure it, but he greatly increased the rate of drone strikes in Yemen. So he has done some of the things that they want.
Yeah, he bombed the shit out of Iraq and Syria. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He was much more belligerent to Iran, things that neocons would love. You're absolutely right. So the question then remains, why do they hate Trump so much? And I think there's been and like the other problem, that I think has that relatedly is that now that neocons and Bush Cheney operatives are so embedded in the Democratic Party. I mean, I've seen this delusional claim that, the Democrats are just using them for their votes, and once the election's over, they're going to... No, that's true of the Democrats on the left. Right. The Democrats use the left for their votes, and once the election is over, there'll be no more union or coalition between Democrats and the left. Those other people are going to exercise a lot of influence in this new administration, in part because it's been a longstanding Democratic centrist establishment dream to be able to merge with these kinds of Republicans. And that's why today there was a potential cabinet list released by the Biden camp to Politico, I think it was. And there's a couple of Republicans being actively considered, including Meg Whitman for fucking commerce, right? But there's no corresponding leftist who's going to be the Secretary of Labor, notwithstanding your accurate, assessment that there'll be better appointees on the sub-cabinet level. So I think that's the other question is there's been not enough questioning about what are the long-term effects of this new coalition. Bush Cheney operatives, neocons, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the large corporate media, and the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And that's very disturbing. In the last few minutes that I have with you, since you alluded to this earlier, and I do want to drill into it just a little bit because I saw that you wrote something just today or yesterday for your Substack about it, which everybody should go subscribe to. You kind of alluded to this claim that the Trump that the Bush administration objectively committed worse crimes and had a worse effect on the world than the Trump administration, which, again, as you say, the sort of partisan valence of how people hear that now is kind of funny because we're comparing two Republicans. But I guess maybe if you could speak to that just a little bit, right? So the obvious reason to think that that's true, or maybe the biggest piece of evidence that would be true, I would think, would be the starting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, kind of punching that hole in the Middle East that's continued to lead to bloodshed and chaos ever since then. But what does the rest of the evidence for that claim look like?
Yeah, and killing upwards of 1 million people in Iraq. Just so before the debate even starts, I just want to hear somebody who disputes this argument that Bush and Cheney, what I was really writing about was the idea that Trump is some singular, unprecedented evil, right? Never before seen, so that everyone who worked for the Trump administration should be permanently ostracized, but people who work for Bush and Cheney or even Obama should be welcomed in decent company, give them NBC shows like they have, like Nicole Wallace and Joe Scarborough, who was a big Bush Cheney supporter, and that's all fine. Nicole Wallace was the actual propagandist, the communications director of the Bush Cheney 2004 re-election campaign while the Iraq war was raging, and then served as the communication director of the Bush, and they love her. She's one of the most popular MSNBC hosts. And the whole litany of journalists who helped sell that war, just that war alone, that killed upwards of 1 million people, that was justified based on lies, that was disseminated and laundered through the media, that, as you said, created huge instability in the Middle East, and as Tony Blair even admitted, gave rise to ISIS. Whatever metric you want to use to evaluate that and compare it in terms of harm done, lies deployed, instability engendered. What did Donald Trump do that's even in the same universe, morally or geostrategically, than that. How do you even begin to make the case? And then, you start adding the stuff on that I began writing about to denounce the implementation of a worldwide torture regime and the legalization of torture through the Bush Justice Department, the execution of a global kidnapping policy called rendition, where people like Muslim clerics and the like were abducted off the streets of Milan and Hamburg and shipped to Egypt and Syria to be tortured on purpose by the most despotic regimes to try and extract information from them. The creation of a due process-free prison in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called Guantanamo, where 20 years later almost people still are imprisoned in cages without ever having been tried of crimes before. And then domestically, you look at things like Hurricane Katrina, which the liberal consensus held happened, or the aftermath did, because George Bush, in the words of Kanye West, doesn't care about black people. And the constant lies that were told and the bigotry deployed with anti-gay referendum put on the ballot by Karl Rove to energize evangelical voters, and the slaughter of innocent Muslims all over the world. When you start piling up that body count and that, mountain of radical executive power theories, much of which was continued and even expanded by the Obama administration with drones and assassinations of American citizens and the like, to say nothing of the 2008 financial crisis that happened under Bush's watch, and then under Obama, the actions were taken to bail out Wall Street and let homeowners be foreclosed by the hundreds of thousands despite a fund that sat untouched to salvage their mortgages under Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, guru-like wisdom. What are we seeing in the Trump ledger that even equals that, let alone so wildly exceeds it that we ought to regard Trump as the singular evil? I don't, whatever it is that you can count, you can point at, like kids in cages or the coronavirus, or like his racist rhetoric, and all of that finds comparable examples in the presidents that preceded him. And then there's a lot that preceded him that I don't think you find comparable examples of. And so I find this whole historical revisionism of saying that Trump is this fascist dictator, that he's a Nazi-like figure, that he's never before seen evil, to be very self-serving, because the people who propagated that are the same ones who demanded that this narrative be used to cleanse and provide absolution for all of their own crimes and all of their sins, as well as propagandizing a whole generation of people who just began paying attention to politics because of their age, because of fear of Trump, who now believe more than ever in the myth of American exceptionalism, that before Trump, presidents had always been noble and benevolent, that the rule of law was always abided by, that the FBI, the CIA, the NSA are trustworthy institutions. So much damage has been done by this narrative that I think and a lot of it has been propped up by liberals and even to some extent the left, not so much the left, but certainly liberals, that I think it's really worth dismantling, because it's not just, inaccurate in a very profound way, but also quite damaging.
Yeah, and even when it comes to, even when it comes to some of the somewhat unique, crimes of the Trump administration. So the example you gave, the child separation policy, kids in cages, that certainly built on things that had happened earlier, including under Obama, but was an escalation of that war on undocumented immigrants, or the Muslim ban. These are things that I mean, some, like, part of the Bush side of the ledger does need to be Trump, because certainly, in terms of Trump, the Trump administration's escalations of American brutality towards undocumented immigrants, ICE was created by the Bush administration. When they created the Department of Homeland Security and reorganized federal agencies around there. The INS existed before that, but this was certainly a much more beefed up and militarized version of that. And also, it's very hard for me to imagine a candidate who was fear-mongering about Muslims in the way that Trump was, planning to ban every Muslim in the world, like he said he would in 2016, before the watered down versions of the Muslim ban that ended up going through. without the Bush administration's decision to frame the 9/11 attacks not as a criminal action by a small group of terrorists, but as this civilizational threat that needed to be responded to with a conflict that would be on the level of something like the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. I think, if you look at the pre-Trump Republican Party, there's very little that the Trump administration did that's a deviation from it. And the few examples of those deviations, I don't mean like slight expansions, I mean actual departures, you could actually say are good from a left-wing perspective, like questioning NATO, questioning the war in Iraq, even though he was supportive of it, questioning why we're constantly interfering in other countries to change their governments. I think wanting better relations rather than more belligerence with Moscow. In those cases where Trump did radically deviate from Republican doctrine, that generally isn't, those things are not considered bad, but good. But by and large, I think other than the stylistic parts of Trump's behavior and his tweets, the Trump administration looks to me like a pretty ordinary Republican administration, except that it didn't have the fuel of the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror and the war in Iraq to prop up so many of those abuses. And it provoked a lot of resistance, largely because of these behavioral things that George Bush and Dick Cheney never encountered. I mean, the press was incredibly anemic under the Bush administration. That's why I started blogging, and so many other people did as well. The Democratic Party was incredibly meek. There was not very much citizen marches. There obviously was against the war in Iraq, but not against these broader war on terror abuses. And so a lot of the ability of Bush and Cheney to implement evil was greater. It doesn't mean that George Bush is a worse person than Dick Cheney. It just means the government itself did a lot more damage and a lot more harm.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I am cautiously optimistic, not about the Biden administration itself, which I think is going to be, as you say, these like Lincoln Project kinds of neocon ghouls are going to have huge influence in it. It's probably going to have a Republican Senate to use as plausible deniability when it doesn't do any of the good stuff that is on the Biden-Harris campaign website. I think it's going to be awful. But that I think there is a case to be made for optimism about movements from below. That certainly, if you look at the Bush administration, when, like you said, after the anti-war movement, there were not a lot of people marching the streets, or when they were, it was some asinine nonsense like that Jon Stewart rally to restore sanity. But whereas during the Obama years, we had the beginnings of Black Lives Matter. There was Occupy Wall Street. There was the Bernie Sanders campaign winning 22 states. None of which is to say that this is somehow like, to the credit of the Obama administration, or they did anything to spark this. In fact, they did quite a bit to squelch some of these things. But I guess the case for optimism looks to me like this, and maybe we can close on your reaction to this, that when there is a ostentatiously reactionary right-wing Republican in office, oppositional energy often ends up getting diverted to that person as an individual. If only we got rid of that terrible smirking cowboy George W. Bush, everything would be fine. If only we got rid of that horrible Cheeto, everything would be fine. Whereas when you have some personally pleasant centrist Democrat like Barack Obama in office, and you still have the same dissatisfaction, for a lot of the same reasons, then it might be more likely to be channeled to somewhat more systemic issues like police violence with BLM, or like economic inequality with Occupy Wall Street, just because it's a little bit harder for people to tell themselves that, oh, the problem is all about this one individual and all problems will be solved by getting rid of him.
Yeah, I am very interested, obviously, in what the post-Trump landscape looks like. I do base a lot of my expectations on what I witnessed personally and went through when I watched the very high levels of anti-war and pro-civil liberties and anti-corporatist fervor under George Bush and Dick Cheney all but disappear upon the inauguration of Barack Obama. Not entirely. There were some people who kept it up, but certainly a huge chunk of it was co-opted and annexed, and it's kind of morphed into Democratic Party cheerleading. And it might be that that was because Obama was such a singularly exciting figure who people, including me, believed was going to do a lot more good than he actually ended up doing. Whereas Biden doesn't really inspire that in anybody, really. So hopefully the chances are lower. But what I worry about is the following, which is that narrative that we were discussing a few minutes ago, that Trump is a singular evil, that he's kind of like a Hitler figure, that there's this like movement behind him that's fascist and white supremacist, does domestic terrorism, wants to implement coups. That narrative has been so beneficial to so many people, media outlets profiting from it, people's careers being launched because of it, their reputations being rehabilitated, agencies being able to posture as defenders of the good in a convincing way to a lot of people, that I really can't see that narrative just being jettisoned so easily. People are going to want to cling to it. And the way they're going to cling to it is by saying that even though Trump's gone, there's still these huge pockets of white supremacists, fascists, militias, and, you know, plotters of violence and getting ready to take over the Senate or the House in 2022, and then the White House in 2024, such that any criticism of Biden and Harris basically constitutes siding with fascism. That maybe fascism isn't in the White House anymore, but it hasn't gone away. I think it's going to be very persuasive to a lot of people. They're going to be hearing that from a lot of the media outlets they trust, a lot of the writers they believe in. And I'm not so sure that there's going to be this kind of restoration of the role of the left, which is criticizing the Democratic Party from the left. I think a lot of people on the left are going to be persuaded that they have an ongoing moral duty to more or less stay behind the Democratic Party, because any attempt to weaken it is to strengthen the far worse fascists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there will be. I'm sure there will be some of that. I hope. It's an open question how successful those co-optation strategies are. I mean, I guess I'm like, the thing that makes me optimistic, to the extent that I can summon up any optimism, is that we didn't have that when Obama came to office, like the closest thing there was. There were lots of people who were making lots of noise about all the issues that you just mentioned, right? But there wasn't anything that really conceived of itself as an alternative to the Democratic establishment, I think, in quite the same way as you have now with, DSA and the Squad, which is very imperfect, but I'm glad it's there, and what's left of the Bernie movement. But I guess we'll just have to see if that actually does all manage to assert itself as anything and keep developing during the Biden years, or if it's just all kind of swept up into this constant incentive to how can you criticize the Biden administration when we're only 6 months away from the midterm elections, or don't you know what's going on in this state, which I'm sure will be a constant voice in the other direction.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I hope that optimism is warranted. I'm sure there will be some people who continue to do that, and the question just becomes how many.
Fair enough. Thanks, Glenn. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Ben. Keep up the great work. I'm a fan of what you're doing, so I appreciate you inviting me on.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. That was Glenn Greenwald, formerly of The Intercept. You can read his work now at greenwald.substack.com. And before that, spoke to David Griscom for our Outlaws and Revolutionaries segment that usually comes at the end, but the way the time worked out today, we had to do that a little bit earlier. And before that, Matt Chrisman who is a pleasure to talk to as always. Before I sign off today, I do want to just let you guys know about a few things that are coming up. So one of them is doing this debate with Kay Fellows about abortion rights at Modern Debate. And as always, that's going to be reposted on my YouTube channel. I think probably we're going to do that on Tuesday, repost it there, premiere it there on the YouTube channel. Also, we are starting this month to do these monthly bonus episodes recapping my favorite TV show, The Sopranos. So my co-pilots for those Sopranos bonus episodes are going to be Nando Villa, Wozni, Big Waz, Lambre, and Mike Racine, who are all fun and funny and intelligent people who I'm really looking forward to chatting about the show with. So the first one of those is going to be recorded on Tuesday, released sometime shortly thereafter. I still have to figure out the exact schedule there. Also wrote a couple of things that you could check out. One of them was at Current Affairs. It's called Arguing with Glenn Beck. I co-wrote that with Nathan J. Robinson, who's of course the editor of Current Affairs and has been a guest on the show. And I don't think it's a state secret that I don't always see eye to eye with Nathan on intra-left disputes, but he's a friend and a comrade and somebody whose writing I've tremendously admired for years. When I talk about giving them an argument, as something leftists should do more of, the exemplars I always think of, or a couple of them, are Glenn Greenwald and Nathan Robinson. So it was a huge honor to write that piece with him. And I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. There was a trimmed version that was in the print issue of Current Affairs that was released at the end of the summer. But this is the full uncut thing that includes stuff like our argument about why the idea that we can influence things by voting with our dollars in a free market is largely nonsensical. So check that out. That's at the Current Affairs website. It's called Arguing with Glenn Beck. And also, I've had two things up at Jacobin in the last week. One of them is called Let Everyone Vote, and it's about the obscenely large number of people, possibly more than 31 million on my back of the envelope calculations, who were not able to vote in this election. So we're talking there about prisoners, 2.3 million people serving in state and federal prisons, and other than state prisoners in Vermont and Maine. That in the other 48 states and in the federal prison system, prisoners aren't allowed to vote, and that includes millions more who are parolees or who are ex-cons in states that continue to disenfranchise people who've committed felonies after they get out of prison, and there are between 10.5 and 12 million people in there who are undocumented immigrants. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, they broke the law. They're in this country illegally. Why should they be allowed to vote in our elections? Which I think is very harsh and ridiculous, considering that we're talking about people who are peaceful people moving around from one area to another without permission, but who are often fleeing from really unspeakable levels of poverty, cartel violence, brutality. And you could say, oh, well, of course they shouldn't be allowed to vote because they're not citizens, which sounds like an argument, but is actually just an elaborate way of banging at the table and insisting that you like the status quo, because citizen just means somebody who's awarded certain legal rights, like the right to vote. And even if you think that it's okay that undocumented immigrants aren't allowed to vote because they're undocumented, that still leaves us with 13.2 million green card holders. So these are people who have been living in the United States for at least 5 years. You have to in order to apply for a green card, and who are expecting to keep on living in the United States for the long haul. That's what it is. That's what the card is for, a permanent residency. So they have been in the United States for years. They will be in the United States for the foreseeable future. While there, they have to pay American taxes and follow American laws, but they aren't allowed to have a vote and hence a voice in determining who gets to make those laws, which in all of the contexts we would consider to be a basic human right, the right to democratic self-governance. We normally think that's not something you have to earn. That's something everybody should have just by virtue of being human. And you can get into all kinds of other arguments about the prisoners and whether, breaking the social contract means that you shouldn't be allowed to vote, and whether that makes sense, even if you ignore the ridiculous idealization of pretending that anybody who ends up in prison in under circumstances of drug prohibition, pervasive poverty, and mass incarceration is some sort of horrible evildoer. But obviously, I get into all that in the article. Check that out. And the other one, which just went up, is called "No Honeymoon" for Joe Biden, and that one argues that whereas it is good, in my view, right, as I was talking about a bit with David Griscom, as I was arguing just now to Glenn Greenwald, it is good that Trump lost. That's something that's worthy of celebration. If there were ever a time where the victory of the lesser evil over the greater evil merited busting out a bottle of champagne, this would be it, considering everything from appointing hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board and turning back the clock on labor law almost to where it was in the 1930s in some ways, to banning Muslims, to separating children from their parents, to criminal negligence with the coronavirus. It is a good thing that the Trump is over, but just being less evil than Trump does not mean that you're not an implacable enemy of the working class. And this is alluded to at various points in the episode today. I argue extensively in the article that that's what Biden is. If you look at his record, you look at the record of the Obama-Biden administration, we shouldn't take seriously any of the good stuff that's on his campaign website. We should expect that he's going to govern like Obama did when Obama did things like expand the drone war and preside over 8 years of expansion of the gap between the rich and poor and wage war against teachers unions. And we should be buckled up for that with Biden. And we certainly shouldn't give the Biden administration any reprieve from relentless left criticism, any sort of honeymoon period in which we see what they do. We know what they're going to do. They are going to act like Keir Starmer has been acting in the UK. We were talking about that in the last episode with the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, and really have every interest in crushing that rowdy left flank. So I think we're at war with the Democratic establishment, whether we want to be or not. So we might as well want to be. So again, that article in Jacobin is called "No Honeymoon" for Joe Biden. So look forward to the debate on abortion with Kay Fellows and the first monthly bonus episode recapping The Sopranos, which if we have time, if we get to both of them, we're going to talk about the first 2 episodes, The Sopranos and 46 Along. So really looking forward to those. Those should be a lot of fun. There's a lot more coming up. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, you should do that. There's tons of stuff in between episodes, like the debate that I just mentioned, but also there have been a lot of live streams. There are going to be a lot more. We're going to start doing that more regularly. And so you should subscribe to that. And should like this video if you're watching it. If you're watching on YouTube, it's a small thing, but it actually does make a difference. It actually is helpful. And if you are in a position to do so, I understand if you're not. Trust me, I was an adjunct until last year. There were plenty of months there where a $5 recurring donation would have actually been a problem because things were so tight at the end of the month. But if you are in a position to, for the monthly cost of a milkshake at the 50s Nostalgia Diner in Pulp Fiction, you get early access to every single episode. You can watch it live on the unlisted stream while it's being recorded before it goes into editing over the weekend, so it can come out in the nice edited version on podcast form and on the YouTube premiere on Mondays. You also get regular Discord office hours, group voice chats, and which have been a lot of fun. We've covered a lot of really interesting territory in those. And you're also going to start getting some Patreon exclusive bonus episodes. Still trying to figure that out, but I think might be due recording one maybe even this week with Jesse Single, so look out for that. But again, these were all gestures of gratitude. The basic thing is it's not a subscription service. It's a matter of solidarity and support. If you like what we're doing here, please do consider supporting it in that way. I do say we on purpose, not me, not if you like what I am doing here, because like any show like this is brought to you by people that you don't see on camera. Who are doing things like video editing and helping with various aspects of the YouTube channel and designing logos. And I would really like to be able to pay all of those people a living wage, to be able to pay all of them at all. Some of them are getting paid, some of them haven't been able to yet. Ultimately, I'd like to be able to pay myself a living wage just out of doing this, so I could spend my life doing a lot more of this and a lot less teaching. So again, if you're in a position to, please do consider becoming a patron. And even if you aren't, if you like and subscribe on YouTube, like and subscribe, rate and review wherever you get podcasts, all of those things really do help. I've been humbled by all the support I've already gotten, how quickly the show has grown in its very short existence. So thank you to all of you. Take a moment to celebrate the fall of the Trump administration. It is a good thing, despite everything that I've been saying in this episode, and everything I say in the Jacobin article. You got to celebrate what victories you have, even if they're very incomplete and complicated ones, or you're not going to get through this. So something to keep in mind. But thank all you guys so much for watching and listening. Left is best.